as well. All right. So colleagues, welcome to part two, or part B rather, in our AUI 4862 orientation seminar for the 2026 academic year. So what we are now looking into is the discussion around the third assignment question. As I indicated earlier, part of the discussions is pertinent to assignment 3 for the 2025 academic year, which is of course going to be around question 1 in that particular assignment question. So I've shared that with you guys on the group. So I wanted to, briefly take you guys through that. Now, here's your typical exam approach or tip that I would want to give to you guys. When you are looking into an essay-based type of a question such as this, your point of departure normally is, or rather your starting point is always to assess and evaluate the required section of the question. So without even looking into, say, a typical case study scenario, the first thing you do is to assess and to evaluate the required section of that particular question. That's the first thing that you're going to do. So I'm going to do that exercise shortly, and then we can discuss into this question into detail. So if you scroll further down, you'd notice that the required part of the question is given over here. So that's your starting point. So they ask you to, with reference to the King 4, discuss and indicate if Baobab Limited's practices as indicated in the above, that is A to F, meet the requirements of the King 4, right? So the first thing that we want to do is to analyze and evaluate, as I indicated earlier. What exactly does this imply, or rather, what is it that the examiner expects of you as a student? So when you get a question of this nature, where they want you to discuss as well as to indicate, whether this practice is performed within this particular entity align with the requirements of the King 4 report, there are two ways by which one can respond to this question of this nature. One is where you either tabulate your responses, and I'm going to show you what do I mean by that. Or the other is where you list and then you do the discussion thereafter. All right. So when I'm saying list, I'm saying the first thing you do is, if you read the practice or the activity that is happening, for instance, in bullet point number A, you're going to indicate compliance, and then you state or you give your validations why you are saying there's compliance with the King 4 report. Or you indicate there's compliance with principle 4 of the King 4 report, for example. Then you explain why you're saying that there is compliance. So for example, this was just me illustrating, obviously. So say you're evaluating statement number A. You're going to indicate whether there is compliance or non-compliance with the King 4 recommendation, right? And then you state, first of all, second after you state the recommendation of the King 4. In other words, you quote the King 4 principle that is applicable to the context of statement number A. And then you obviously discuss the instance of non-compliance. And the same thing is true. You also discuss the instance of compliance. That is if, statement A is in compliance with the King 4 report. So if you are to list and discuss, this is what the examiner or what the lecturer would expect to see from you guys. So I repeat again, the first thing you do is to indicate whether there's compliance or non-compliance. Then number 2, you stipulate what the King 4 report states. And then number 3, you basically just validate, in other words, justifying why you've stated whether there is, or rather why you have indicated compliance or non-compliance to the King 4 report. Does it make sense, colleagues?
Yes, it does.
All right, brilliant. Then I wanted to show you the tabular format. So what I'm just going to do here, I will switch to the whiteboard screen for that. just to illustrate what I meant when I'm saying you can also tabulate this. All right. So I'm just going to try and quickly do that. So on a whiteboard screen, this is just an illustration of structure, in response to a question of this nature. So one can actually tabulate their responses in this way. So on the first column, since the question say describe and indicate instances, right, of non-compliance or compliance with the King 4 report. So here you indicate, or in fact, you don't have to say indicate. So you're just simply going to say compliance or non-compliance. For the sake of space, this is obviously non-compliance with the King 4 report. All right, recommendation. That's what I meant with the dots there, right? And then in the second column, you're going to indicate the King 4 recommendation, or in other words, stipulation, what it states in the King 4, right? And then in the other column, which is the last column, this is where you do your discussion. All right. Giving the so in the third column, basically what you're doing is you are describing, or rather you're giving reasons why you are saying there's an instance of, for instance, if it's compliance, right? Obviously here you would have indicated the statement that you're dealing with. So if it's statement A, you would have stated here maybe there's compliance with the King 4 report, right? And then here you'd state, maybe it's principle 4 of the King 4 report. Then you give, the description or the stipulations of the King 4 report regarding to principle number 4. And then on the last column, you're going to then, of course, give the description or validation, rather, why you're saying there's compliance to that particular principle. What is it that the organization or the company in this regards is doing that suggests that there's compliance with the King 4 report in that sense. Right. So that's another way that you can present your answers. So either way, whether you present it in a tabular format like this, you would still be correct. Or you present it the other way that I'd shown you guys earlier, you would still be on track. You will still be marked correct. How do I know about this? Well, when I looked into some of the previous assignment questions and solutions for that matter, remember I mentioned about past assignments and their solutions. So the purpose of solutions, for example, on the past assignments is to give you a guide, as to whether you're on track in the approach that they want you to apply in responding to certain questions. So I did noted that when you get questions like this, they sometimes present it in the tabular format, or they actually list and then discuss the points in the following approach that I indicated to you guys earlier. So, sorry. Okay, I thought it was a question. All right. So I think that was it in regards to the steps. So the first step, remember, you evaluate the required part of the question. That's your point of departure. Please don't forget that. And then the next thing after you've done that, the next step it will be for you to go through the case study scenario now. So now when you do that, what you're simply doing is to identify what I think, guys, you need to mute yourselves, no? Okay, thank you. Right. So the second step that you would perform is identifying what I call problem areas. Now, these problem areas are guided by what you have looked into from the required section. Remember what they are saying in the required part. They want you to discuss and indicate if Baobab Limited's practices, as indicated in the above, meet the requirements of the King 4 report. So as I go through now the scenario, I'm looking for those practices in point A all the way to point F. That's what I'm looking for. to identify the problem areas that enable me to respond to the required part that the lecturer expects of me. So now, Baobab Limited is a manufacturing company located in Polokwane in the Limpopo province. Below is important information about the organization. So now, in my mind, when I look at this, colleagues, this is purely background information about the organization that we are dealing with. That's all. So what do I know? What do I note from that? Number one, it's a public company, right? That's number one. Number two, it's in the manufacturing sector, and they also give me an indication of where they are located. That's all that I'm picking from that. So hence, I'm saying this is just purely background information to me. Then the next thing I do is to then continue further with the scenario to identify the problem area. So your first problem area is this, point number A, where they tell you that the following statement is the only statement regarding organizational ethics in the organization's integrated report. And then look at the mark allocation, 6 marks. So let's find out what was the statement stipulating. Sorry. Right. So all stakeholders of Baobab Limited, and especially directors and employees, are required to maintain the organization's code of ethics to ensure that business practices are conducted in a manner that is beyond reproach. Baobab Limited has not established a formal process for obtaining assurance on ethical awareness and ethical compliance throughout the organization. Very important. So now here's what I want you guys to observe. Remember, we already know point A is our problem area. So we want to then look into the practice, what they are doing, right, as far as that point is concerned. So clearly, number one, what we can take note of is the fact that okay, let me just reread this statement again. All stakeholders of Baobab Limited, and especially directors and employees, are required to maintain the organization's code of ethics, meaning to say they already have the organization code, I mean, the organizational code of ethics. So it's in existence. That's number one. Okay, cool. To ensure that business practices are conducted in a manner that is beyond reproach. Right. Baobab Limited is not established. Okay, that's another aspect. Now, what I already see from this first statement that we've just read, right? All stakeholders of Baobab Limited, and then they give emphasis on which of these stakeholders are expected to be in compliance with the code of ethics of the organization. Who are these stakeholders of primary focus? To me, it appears to be primarily directors and employees. What does that tell you? Well, it tells me that it appears that the organizational code of ethics, it's internally focused. It does not incorporate the external stakeholders. Now, but according to the King 4 recommendation, it is expected that a code of ethics should encompass all the various stakeholders. That is, of course, to include external parties. So I'm going to open the King 4. I can open the King 4, but I can also open the Jackson and Stearns just as a point of reference for you guys to note. All right, so I'm just going to do that quickly because I know we have limited time, but I'm just trying my level best to ensure that we cover as much as possible in this regard. So just bear with me, colleagues. All right, Jackson and Stearns. It's going to open shortly. So you'd notice it will be titled Audit Notes. I'm also going to share this with you guys at the end of this session. So in the auditing notes, or what they call Jackson and Stearns, Jackson and Stearns is basically the authors for this particular textbook. Now, notice it's not necessarily your prescribed textbook, but it's a recommended textbook. You discover when you go through your study guide, they do give reference to this, right? Chapter 4, colleagues, deals with this subject matter around corporate governance, and also, to be more precise, the King 4 report, right? But it touches the surface. It doesn't give you as comprehensive details as to what you would find if you were to open the actual King 4 report itself, right? But for argument's sake and for time's sake, I'm just going to show you what we are dealing with in this question. So it's pertinent to principle 2 in the King 4 report, okay? Which is of course on organizational ethics. So here it is. So if I was to be responding to this question, here is one of the things that the lecturer would expect you to state. So they would expect you to give what is it, stipulations in the King 4 report as it appears. So how do you do that? So I'd already done that analysis for you, right? So if you may just allow me to do that. Here it is. So you're going to state something like this, where you state according to principle 2 of the King 4 report, paragraph 4 to paragraph 7 in the King 4 report. So if you are to open the King 4 report, if you go on page 48 to be exact, right? Here is what it states regarding the King 4 report on corporate governance, right? Baobab Limited's ethical climate is not sound. So this is my discussion now. Is not sound and it falls short of alignment with the King 4 recommendations of the King 4 report. Here are my reasons. Number one, it appears that the organizational code of ethics is not fully inclusive of what? External role players. All right. And they may not be aware of its existence, resulting in possible what? Instances of unethical business engagements or violation of consumer rights, etc. and etc. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because they are mentioning that all stakeholders of Baobab Limited, especially directors and employees, are required to maintain the organization's code of ethics to ensure the business practices are conducted in a manner that is beyond reproach. But what about the external parties, such as customers, such as suppliers, the society, for example, and likes? So, or maybe shareholders, what about those? How do they relate to the company as far as their organizational code of ethics is concerned? You get it? So that's why I'm saying here in this instance that it appears that the organization, or rather organizational code of ethics, is not fully inclusive, or rather it's not fully comprehensive to incorporate external role players. Why? As it appears to be more centered rather on the internal parties, and that would obviously result in the external role players not being aware of what is expected of them as far as the company's code of ethics is concerned. Now, that was just one part of it. If you continue further with the very same statement, you'd notice they state Baobab Limited has not established a formal process for obtaining assurance on ethical awareness. So that is to tell you that assurance is non-existent as far as what? As far as ethical awareness is concerned, and not only limited to that. Let me just reread the statement again. So Baobab Limited has not established a formal process for obtaining assurance on ethical awareness and ethical compliance throughout the organization. So in other words, there are no audits that they are conducting just to ensure that organizational ethics in this organization is efficient, is effective, enough to the organization. That's basically what they're saying to you. So that's another part which is not in compliance with the King 4 report, right? So now here is how you could have presented that particular aspect. All right. So number 2, now this is the second point where I'm now addressing this point. So there appears to be no ethical awareness training and ethical compliance throughout the entire organization, which calls into question the management's integrity and the quality of their ethical culture in Baobab Limited. So in other words, their ethical culture as an entity might not be effective. There's no grounds that substantiate whether indeed, they are conducting their business in an ethical manner. Okay. So if you don't have this, for instance, if you don't have a formal process to obtain assurance, then there is no way that you can be assured that indeed things are being done in an ethical manner. Okay. Right. So again, the other part, just to, of course, continue or rather to expound further on that same point, around assurance. There's no assurance about whether all the relevant stakeholders have an understanding of the organization's ethical code of ethics in place. So this could impair what? The ethical climate in Baobab Limited and in turn bring the company into disrepute. Because there's a public company, for example, but now that would be something outside of this box. I mean, outside of the box, really. As a public company, there are legal compliance regulations that they are expected to also observe, and some would obviously involve, this element of organizational ethics. I mean, if you look into the Companies Act, for instance, right? So those are some of the things that one would have to consider. So now, just me adding to this, there is a likelihood of unethical behaviors. So what am I doing? I'm giving like an overall conclusion to this case of this entity. So there's a likelihood of unethical behaviors perpetrated by directors and employees without trace. So in other words, concealment of their unethical behaviors is likely to take place now, and not held accountable for their actions, decisions, or business conduct within this organization and its engagement with third parties. So, third parties in this instance, it would refer to customers or what they call consumers, suppliers, and government regulators, just to name a few. So, what have we done? This is like an overall conclusion of all the points that I've given. So, if I was to be presenting this in the tabular format, all the points that I've given you now, that I was just explaining, this is what would fall in the third column. All right. This is what would fall in the third column of your table. But then if you are presenting this in this approach where you are, listing and discussing, this would be what you would state in your last point. All the 3 points that I've given you, they would fall into, this third last bullet point where I'm saying discuss the instance of non-compliance. That's your justification as to why, of course, I mean, if I was you in this case, the first point I would have stated regarding to statement A is that there is non-compliance with the King 4 recommendations. That's the first thing I would have stated. Then the second thing that I would have stated would be the reference, which is, of course, Principle 2 of the King 4 report, to be exact, paragraph number 4 to 7 within that principle, right? Now, one might ask, do they really want you to state the exact paragraphs, the principles, and all that jazz? Well, to be quite frank, it's not really necessary to give indications of the paragraphs as such. But I mean, at your level now, at postgraduate level, it's expected that you should know the principles of the King 4 report. Are we together, colleagues? Are you still there?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Awesome. Do you guys have any questions so far with regards to what I've just covered around point A before I proceed to point B? Or maybe you want to ask the questions afterwards. Okay. Then, all right. So let's proceed if there's no questions. To point number B, I mean, statement number B. So in statement B, here's what they tell you. The Code of Ethics addresses the organization's interaction, with all internal stakeholders. I repeat again, the Code of Ethics addresses the organization's interaction with who? All internal stakeholders. But then what about the external stakeholders? Now my question to you, colleagues, is this in compliance with that King 4, principle number 2 on organizational ethics? Compliance or no compliance? It's a question I'm asking.
No compliance.
Yeah,
Non-compliance because
yes, you can go ahead.
I was saying non-compliance because it disregarded the external factors, external stakeholders.
Yes, affirmative. So clearly, there's non-compliance. I mean, so now when you look into a question like this with 2 marks, comparing to the first point or statement with 6 marks, mark allocations are also there to guide you in terms of quantity of writing that you need to apply to it. So you cannot have then 3 points like what I did with statement number A. So here, what you're simply going to do is non-compliance with obviously it will be principle 2 of the King 4 report. Why? Since the current or the existing organizational code does not consider external stakeholders. That's all you're going to state there. But anyways, let me just show you how I had, done the analogy for you. Okay. So according to principle 2 of the King 4 report, paragraph 6 in the King 4. So this is me giving exact references in the King 4 report itself. So if you go on page 48, maybe I could just, but because time is limited, this Zoom thing, it seems to be timed. We're only given like 40 minutes, but I'm going to upgrade this version, I think by next week. So that we don't have to cut and then come back after like a certain amount of minutes. Anyways, so according to principle 2 of the King 4 report on corporate governance, right, paragraph 6 in the King 4 report, there's no compliance with the King 4 report. Baobab Limited's code of ethics has been designed to address its interactions with internal stakeholders only and falls short in its exclusion of external role players. Now, a bit, with me, when I respond to questions, I try to, to give them as much details as possible. Why is it so? It's expected of you at this level. I mean, it guarantees you to get as much marks as possible, or if not all the marks allocated to the question. Now, so a business does not exist in isolation, but through interaction from both internal and external role players. And as such, the code of ethics in Baobab Limited should address both parties. So this statement that I added there, it was because during the time when I was discussing the assignment with the group for last year, I had to explain to them, why I'm saying, the current or rather the existing code of ethics in this entity, it falls short of its, exclusions of external role players and stuff like that, and how it can affect the company rather, if it's like that. All right, so nothing much really to state around that. Number C, we are told to ensure that all stakeholders are aware of the existence and content of the code of ethics. It was uploaded on the organization's website, right? What do you guys think? Do you think there's compliance there or no compliance, really?
There is compliance.
Yes. So there is compliance to the King 4 report. I think let me just show you some of the things that are stipulated, I think around this aspect, just so that you can see them. So where it says recommended practices, that's basically some of the things or elements of the King 4. So the board should set the direction of how ethics is approached. They should approve the codes of ethics, ensure that the codes of conduct and policies encompass the company's interaction with both internal and external stakeholders, address the key ethical risks of the company, and then so this part I'm about to read is the one that relates to the question, where they're saying the directors should ensure that the codes of conduct and ethics policies provide for arrangements that familiarize employees, now observe, and other stakeholders with the company's ethical standard, including how publishing the codes and policies on the company's website or other social media platforms. In the instance, of course, with employees, it will be incorporated in the employment contracts. If it's with relation to external parties, maybe supplier contracts. And then, of course, holding workshops and seminars to inform employees about the relevant codes and how they are implemented in the workplace, right? So that's what you find, obviously, if you have to go in the exact King 4 report, you find all this, right? But obviously in the King 4, it will be more comprehensive than what you are seeing in the textbook. Yeah, I see a hand. Tabile, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to find out, Uguti, are we able to indicate maybe partly compliant on the basis that when you read that section or that paragraphs or those paragraphs was extending in terms of what they should do?
Correct.
when it comes to uploading and other stuff, since it's 5 marks.
Yes, that's the reason why it's like that. That's the reason why it's like that. I mean, that's why they've allocated 5 marks to that. So they would have expected one to expand a bit further to say okay, so there's partial compliance, right? The partial compliance being that for the internal role players, right, they are able to access this. But I guess if it's on the organization's website, don't you think even the external role players have access to that?
They probably do, but then I need to, there's an extension in terms of the.
Oh, yes, exactly. 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 So, but and then they did not give us indication about whether it's incorporated in their, supplier contracts, if any exists, in that regard. So this one is it's a very interesting question, really. But anyways, let me just show you how I addressed it, right? There we go.